Morning, everyone. Just a second. Having a morning herbal cigarette, and the reading will be commencing in about 3 minutes, hopefully. Reading chapter 4 of The Pentagon's Brain by Annie Jacobson. Feel free to stop me and join me on screen. Otherwise, please leave comments and I'll reply to them after the reading. Thank you very much indeed. I see the birds, isn't it? Excuse me. Right. Oh. Morning. Morning. Right. Yeah. Right. This is enjoyable for you. Certainly a very interesting book. Getting very, very well, very, very interesting. Further we get into the book, and of course it starts a few. If you scroll down through the past live streams, you'll see a picture. I'm holding the book up. Well, that's part one. And it starts about, I don't know, about 30 minutes in or something. I think I just started normal live stream. And I kind of wasn't sure what to do, so I just started reading the book. So I can't remember which was the bottom, but I started reading the book and got into reading it. And no one stopped me, so I carried on. You know, kind of thing. So here we go with chapter 4. Yes, emergency plans. Right, what I'll do is just recap chapter 3. I'll go partially back here to give you the kind of date. We're talking about 1958-ish time. I'll tell you what, I'll read chapter 3 again. We'll recap on chapter 3 because it is quite interesting. I'll try and read this as quick as possible. Obviously, stop me if you like. Right, this is chapter 3, Vast Weapon Systems of the Future. Right. Right. It was October the 4th, 1957, 6 p.m. Cocktail hour at the Officers Club at the Army Ballistic Missile Agency in Huntsville, Alabama, or Rocket City, USA. Neil, oh dear, I'm not reading this for a while. I think I'll start again, actually. Right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Right, we're on there. Chapter 3, Vast Weapon System of the Future. It was October 4th, 1957, 6 o'clock p.m. Cocktail hour at the Officers Club at the Army Ballistic Missile Agency in Huntsville, Alabama, or Rocket City, USA. Neil H. McElroy, a corporate executive soon to be confirmed as Secretary of Defense, had just arrived in a military jet with an entourage of defense officials from the Pentagon. Inside the Officers Club, drinks flowed freely. Appetizers were passed among the men. McElroy stood chatting with Werner von Braun, the famous German rocket scientist who now serves as Director of Development Operations at Huntsville, when a press officer named Gordon Harris rushed into the room and interrupted the party with an extraordinary announcement. "The Russians have put up a satellite," Harris shouted. The room fell silent for several moments. Only the background music and the tinkling of ice cubes could be heard. "It's broadcasting signals on a common frequency," Harris said. "At least one of our local hams has been listening to it." A barrage of questions followed. It did not take long for news of Sputnik to become official. A Soviet news agency TASS released a statement providing technical information and specifics about the artificial satellite of the Earth. The Soviets had beaten the Americans into space. Not since Pearl Harbor had the Pentagon been caught by a surprise of such consequence. We weren't actually taken by surprise, obviously. Annie didn't say that in the book, otherwise it wouldn't have been published. But LBJ knew all about Pearl Harbor, and he let it happen because he wanted to get into World War II. That's dealt with. You can look that one up if you want. It's common knowledge, not an official publication, but it's fairly common knowledge. Right, the nation slipped into panic over what was seen as a superior Soviet scientific prowess. Eisenhower's attempts to minimize the significance of Sputnik had a reverse effect, with many Americans accusing the president of trying to conceal U.S. military weakness. I'm going to turn this fan off because it might be interfering with the actual sound. So there we go. It's pretty boiling hot in here this morning, I must say. Right. So, his attempts to minimize the significance of Sputnik had a reverse effect, with many Americans accusing the president of trying to conceal U.S. military weakness. Sputnik weighed only 184 pounds. It had been launched into space by a Soviet ICBM. Soon afterwards, the Soviet ICBM would be able to carry a much heavier payload, such as a nuclear bomb, halfway across the world to any target in the United States. The situation was made worse when on December 20, 1957, someone leaked top-secret analysis of the Soviet threat called the Gazer Report to the Washington Post. The report portrays the United States in the gravest danger in its history, wrote the Post. A slightly inflammatory headline there. It shows and America exposed to an almost immediate threat from the missile-bristling Soviet Union. If Sputnik had caused mild panic, the Gaither report produced national hysteria. But the Gaither report had its own controversial backstory, one that would remain classified for decades. In the spring of '57, 7 months before Sputnik was launched, President Eisenhower asked his national security advisors to put together a team that could answer one question: how to protect the American people in an all-out nuclear war. A Rand Corporation co-founder, the venture capitalist H. Rowan Gaither, was chosen to chair the new Presidential Research Committee. Making up the body of the panel were officials from NORAD, that's North American Air Defense Command, the Strategic Air Command, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Federal Civil Defense Administration, the Weapons System Engineering Group, and the CIA. There were representatives from the defense contracting industry, including Livermore, Skandia, Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed, Hughes, and RAND. That's an acronym for Research and Development, by the way, the RAND Corporation. Right. The corporate advisors on the panel were from Shell Oil, IBM, Bell Telephone, New York Life Insurance, and Chase Manhattan Bank. In the resulting top secret Gaither report, officially titled Deterrence and Survival in the Nuclear Age, the defense contractors, industrialists, and defense scientists concluded that there was no way to protect US citizens in the event of a nuclear war. Instead, the panel advised the president to focus on building up the US arsenal of nuclear weapons. The most menacing threat came from the Soviet ICBMs, they said. The individuals who calculated the exactitude of the Soviet missile threat were Herb York, scientific director at the Livermore Laboratory, and Jerome Wiesner, a presidential science advisor and MIT engineering professor. No figure mattered more. The Soviets had just successfully launched their first long-range missile from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in what was now Kazakhstan, all the way across Siberia, a distance of 3,000 miles. To determine how many ICBMs the USSR could produce in the immediate future, York and Wiesner set up shop inside the Executive Office building next door to the White House in the summer of '57 and got to work doing calculations. The issue was both real and hot, York recalled. We took the best data there was on the Soviet rocket development program, combined them with what we could learn about the availability of factory floor space in Russia needed for such an enterprise, and concluded that the Soviets, would produce thousands of ICBMs in the next few years. One Castle Bravo, that was the H-bomb, one Castle Bravo, that was a code name for the H-bomb project. So one H-bomb sized bomb dropped on Washington, D.C. would take out the eastern seaboard in a single strike. York and Wiesner's ICBM analysis indicated that the Soviets wanted to be able to strike America 1,000-fold. The information was shocking and alarming. If the Soviets were trying to produce 1,000 ICBMs in only a few years, clearly there was only one rational conclusion to draw. The Soviet Union was preparing for total nuclear war. It would take years to learn that the number York and Wiesner submitted to the Gaither report was nothing more than a wild guess. In the summer of '57, the Soviets had a total of 4 ICBMs built, and in the next few years they would build roughly 100 more. This was a far cry from the thousands of missiles York and Wiesner said the Soviets would be producing in the next few years. The estimate was quite wrong, York conceded 30 years later in a defence of his error. York said, "The problem was simple enough. I knew only a little bit about the Soviet missile development program and nothing about the Soviet industry. In making this estimate, I was thus combining two dubious analytical procedures, worst-case analysis and mirror imaging. How could such an egregious error have happened?" York was asked. "My alibi is that I was new to the subject and that, like the rest of the panel, I was an easy victim of the extreme degree of secrecy that the Russians have always used to conceal what they're doing." York also pointed out that no one on the Gaither Report panel questioned his and Wiesner's mathematics. "I don't remember the others arguing with our views," York said. When President Eisenhower received his copy of the Gaither Report on November 7, 1957, the timing could not have been worse. The Sputnik launch had taken place a mere month before. Eisenhower disagreed with the findings of the report. He had some much better intelligence from the CIA, but it was highly classified, and no one but a small group of individuals knew about it. The CIA pilot, Hervey Stockman, had flown a classified mission of the Soviet Union in a U-2 spy plane the year before. Stockman returned from his dangerous mission with thousands of photographs of Soviet Russia, the first ever. This was before the Corona satellite program, showing that the Russians were not prepared for total war at all. There was only one person on the Gaither panel who had knowledge of this information, and that was CIA Deputy Director Richard Bissell. It was Bissell who was in charge of the U-2 program, which he ran out of a secret base called Area 51 in Nevada. No one else on the Gaither panel had a need to know about the top-secret U-2 program and the multiple missions it had been flying over the Soviet Union. All the Gaither panel had to go by was what York and Wiesner told them in error about Soviet ICBMs. After President Eisenhower rejected most of the findings of the panel, someone leaked the top-secret report to the press. It was York and Wiesner's findings about the missile threat that the public focused on, which was what caused the Sputnik panic to escalate into hysteria. Eisenhower responded by creating the President's Science Advisory Committee to advise him on what to do next. Among those chosen was Herb York, the youngest member of the group. It remains a mystery whether or not the President knew that York was responsible for the most consequential error in the Gaither Report. York soon left Livermore for Washington, D.C., who would remain there for the rest of the Eisenhower presidency. With the narrative of Soviet aggression spinning out of control, the President authorized Secretary of Defense McElroy to proceed with a bold new plan. McElroy was a master of public relations, a 32-year-old veteran of Procter & Gamble, the soap company, of course. McElroy is considered the father of brand management. He began as a door-to-door soap salesman and worked his way up through management in the 1950s. P&G, as Procter & Gamble, had four major soap brands: Ivory, Joy, Tide, and Oxydol. Sales were lagging until McElroy came up with the concept of promoting competition among in-house brands and targeting specific audiences to advertise to. It was McElroy's idea to run soap ads on daytime television, when many American housewives watched TV. By 1957, P&G soap sales had risen to $1 billion a year, and McElroy would be credited with inventing the concept of the soap opera. Soap operas sell lots of soap, he famously said. Now, McElroy was US Secretary of Defense. Wow. He took office with a clear vision. How does a soap salesman end up to be Secretary of Defense? It's just incredible. It's only in America, right? Right, so he took office with a clear vision. I concede the role of the Secretary of Defense to be that of captain of President Eisenhower's defense team. Well spotted. He said his first job as captain was to counter the threat of any future Soviet scientific surprise. Surprise, surprise. On November 2057, just 5 weeks after assuming office, Secretary McElroy went to Capitol Hill with a bold idea. He proposed the creation of a new agency inside the Pentagon called the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA, obviously the precursor to DARPA. This agency would be in charge of the nation's most technologically advanced military projects being researched and developed for national defense, including everything that would be flown in outer space. What we have in mind for that agency, McElroy told lawmakers, was an entity that could handle all satellite and space research and development projects, but also have a function that extends beyond the immediate foreseeable weapons systems of the current or near future. McElroy was looking far, far ahead. America needed an agency that could visualize the nation's needs before those needs yet existed, he said. An agency that could research and develop the vast weapons systems of the future. Congress liked the idea, and McElroy was encouraged to proceed. Excuse me. The military services, however, were adamantly opposed. The Army, Air Force, and Navy were unwilling to give up control of the research and development that was going on inside their individual services, most notably in the vast new frontier that was space. McElroy called the most senior military leaders into his office in the E-ring of the Pentagon to discuss how best to handle the new dimension of outer space. In separate meetings, Army, Air Force, and Navy commanders each insisted that outer space was their services domain. So they're all vying for the domain of so-called outer space. Right, the Army, the moon was simply the high ground. That's incredible, isn't it? And therefore part of its domain. Air Force generals claiming that space, just a little higher up than the area they already controlled, tried to get Secretary McElroy interested in their plans for creating a new aerospace force. The admirals and vice admirals of the US Navy, however, argued that outer space over the oceans was a natural extension of the underwater surface and air regime in which the Navy operated, and should therefore be considered the Navy's domain. General Bernard Shriver of the U.S. Air Force told the Senate Preparedness Subcommittee that he wanted to state on record his strong negative against ARPA. The Atomic Energy Commission had its own ideas about this new agency McElroy was proposing. Ever seeking more power and control, the Atomic Energy Commission lobbied to remove authority over outer space from the Defense Department entirely and have it placed under AEC jurisdiction. That's the Atomic Energy Commission, yeah. The AEC chairman had a bill introduced in Congress to establish an outer space division. Defence contractors also lobbied hard against McElroy's ideas for a new agency. Many feared that their established relations with individual military services would be in jeopardy. Ernest Lawrence of Livermore rushed to the Pentagon to meet personally with Defence Secretary McElroy and present his alternative idea to Harper. Accompanying Lawrence was Charles Thomas, the president of Monsanto Chemical Company. Yeah, they're all in bed together, aren't they? A nuclear defense contractor that would be vilified during the Vietnam War for producing the herbicide Agent Orange, and made notorious in the 1990s for being the first agrochemical company to genetically modify food crops. Lawrence and Thomas met with McElroy in his private office and shared their idea to adopt some radical new measures to meet the Sputnik challenge and cope better with problems of science and technology in the defense establishment. They proposed that McElroy allow the two of them to create and administer a new government agency, classified top secret and modelled after the Manhattan Project. The meeting lasted several hours before McElroy rejected the two defense contractors' idea as infeasible in peacetime. Lawrence had a second suggestion. If this new agency was to work, it would need a brilliant scientist at the helm, someone who understood how the military and industry could put America's best scientists to work solving problems of national defense. The perfect person, said Lawrence, was Herbie Hawke. McElroy promised to give the suggestions some thought. McElroy had one last hurdle to overcome, involving colleagues just one floor away at the Pentagon. The Joint Chiefs of Staff hated the idea of an advanced research projects agency and registered a formal non-concurrence on December 7, 1957. But the attack against ARPA by the military services was bound to fail. The fact that they did not want an ARPA is one reason Eisenhower did, said Admiral John E. Clark, an early ARPA employee. President Eisenhower was fed up with the inter-service rivalries. Having commanded the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces in Europe during World War II, he held deep convictions regarding the value of unity among the military services. As president, he had been a crusader against the excessive waste of resources that came from service duplication. The Army and Air Force race to build almost duplicate CRBM's Continental Range Ballistic Missiles incensed him, wrote presidential historian Sherman Adams. On January 7, 1958, President Eisenhower sent a memorandum to Congress authorizing $10 million in the 1958 fiscal year for expenses necessary for the Advanced Research Projects Agency, including acquisition and construction of such research, development and test facilities and equipment as may be authorized by the Secretary of Defense to remain available until expended. In his State of the Union message 2 nights later, Eisenhower announced to the nation the creation of this new agency. Some of the important new weapons which technology has produced do not fit into any existing service pattern, Eisenhower explained. These new weapons should cut across all services, involving all services, and transcend all services at every stage from development to operation. The rapid technological advances and the revolutionary new weapons in this technology was producing, that this new technology was producing, created a threat as revolutionary to warfare as the invention of the airplane, Eisenhower said. But instead of working together, the services had succumbed to petty jurisdictional disputes that bewilder and confuse the public and create the impression that service differences are damaging the national interest. This was why ARPA had been created, Eisenhower said, in recognition of the need for single control in some of our most advanced development projects. That the President would publicly admonish the services outraged top officials, including the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so the agency was controversial even before it was formed. Wrote Livermore. Wrote Lawrence P. Guise, ARPA's first administrator, in an unpublished history of the agency's origins. Beset by enemies internally, subjected to critical pressures externally, and starting from scratch in a novel area of endeavour, ARPA was a tumultuous and exciting place to be. It was the second week of February 58, and Washington, D.C. was blanketed in snow. A severe blizzard had wreaked havoc on the nation's capital. Sub-zero wind chills and 5-foot snowdrifts paralysed traffic. On Monday morning, the Eisenhower administration advised all non-essential government workers to stay home. Herb York received a telephone call at his house. It was the personal secretary to Neil McAvoy, asking York to come to the Pentagon right away for a meeting with the Secretary of Defense alone. Never mind the storm, York recalled. He was determined to get to the Pentagon. Herb York was in a remarkable position. If he did not have time to reflect on this now, he had paid homage to his humble background later in life. Here he was, living in Washington, D.C., and advising the President of the United States on scientific matters when he had been the first person in his family to attend college. His father was a New York Central Railroad baggage man. His grandfather made caskets for a living. His speciality was lining a customer's permanent resting place with satin bows and carved velvet trim. How nice. Herb York had been born of humble means, but had a brilliant mind and plenty of ambition. To think he was only 36 years of age. From earliest times, York recalled, I remember my father saying he did not want his son to be a railroad man. He made it clear that meant I should go to college, even though he knew little about what was actually entailed. York followed his father's advice, spending most of his free time at the Watertown, New York Public Library, reading newspapers, books, and science magazines. He attended the University of Rochester on a scholarship and excelled in the field he chose for himself, physics. Like many other top university physics graduates of his generation, New York was recruited into the Manhattan Project during the war. In the spring of '43, he travelled by bus to faraway Berkeley, California, where, as circumstance would have it, he was assigned to work under Ernest O. Lawrence. During the war, York helped produce uranium in Lawrence's cyclotron, material that would eventually make its way into the core of the Hiroshima nuclear bomb. After the war, York returned to Berkeley to get his PhD. During his doctoral research, he co-discovered the neutron pi meson, which elevated him to elite status among nuclear scientists. In 1952, York became chief scientist at Livermore. Now, during the February 58 nor'easter, Herb York wondered what lay ahead. I made my way with difficulty across the river to the Pentagon and did a lot of walking in deep snow, York recalled. He had tried to hail a taxi, but there were none around. The parking lot at the Pentagon was almost empty. But the man he had come to see, Secretary of Defence McElroy, was in his office, busy at work. York had a feeling he was being considered for the position of chief scientist at ARPA. Because of the snowstorm, he would benefit, he said, from having an unhurried hour-long one-to-one conversation that I could not have had with the secretary on an ordinary busy day. After the meeting, York went home and McElroy weighed his options. There was one other contender for the position of ARPA chief scientist, and that was Werner von Braun. Von Braun and his team had just launched America's first successful satellite, Explorer 1. And as far as the public was concerned, von Braun's star was on the rise. But Army intelligence had information on von Braun that the rest of the world was most definitely did not know about. Namely, that he had been an officer with the Nazi paramilitary organization, the SS, during the war, and that he was implicated in the deaths of thousands of slave laborers forced to build the V-2 rocket in an underground labor concentration camp called Nordhausen in Nazi Germany. While McElroy weighed his options for scientific director, new information came to light. Von Braun was nothing if not entitled, and in his discussions regarding the new position, he insisted that, were he to transfer his services over to the Pentagon, a sizable group of his German rocket scientists colleagues would have to accompany him there. Army intelligence had classified dossiers on each of von Braun's 113 German colleagues. They were all part of Operation Paperclip, the secret intelligence program that had brought Nazi scientists to America after the war. Many of von Braun's rocket team's members had been ardent Nazis. Members of the ultra-nationalistic paramilitary organizations, including the SS and the SA. For a while, Werner von Braun appeared to have the job, but to get him, it was necessary to take his 10 to 15 man package of German associates. That was not acceptable, wrote ARPA Administrator J. Robert Loftus in a declassified report. Secretary McElroy offered Herb York the job. York accepted. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, he said. York moved into his office in the Pentagon the following month, in March 58. He would remain on the President's Scientific Advisory Board. On the wall of York's new office, he hung a large framed photograph of the moon. Next to it, he hung an empty frame. When people visited, they would ask, "Why an empty frame?" York told them he would leave the frame empty until it could be filled with a photograph of the backside of the moon, taken from a spacecraft to be developed by ARPA. This new agency Herb York was in charge of at the Pentagon would be capable of phenomenal things, he thought. With this new Advanced Research Projects Agency in place, President Eisenhower was more determined than ever to put an end to the nuclear weapons tests. The week after York hung the moon photograph on his office wall, Eisenhower took all of his scientific advisors, including Herb York, to Ramey Air Force Base in Puerto Rico to discuss banning nuclear weapons tests. The president wanted to know, was this good for national security, and if so, could it be done? Everyone voted yes on both counts except Herb York, who abstained. Decades later, York explained his bias. I might well have responded no, but abstain was the most I could under the circumstances. Just weeks on the ARPA job, York felt conflicted. He now served the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense, but he also remained loyal to Ernest Lawrence, whom he had worked for his entire adult life, and who was something of a father figure to him. Edward Teller was York's mentor, the teacher who had taught him most of what he knew about nuclear physics. Lawrence and Teller were all participants in the nuclear weapons program, York later explained. It was their ox that was about to be gored. If the president was able to ban nuclear weapons tests, the Livermore laboratory would most likely cease to exist. The following day, after hearing arguments from the other scientists, York changed his position and voted in favor of a nuclear weapons test ban. It did not take long for word to reach Livermore, where Edward Teller became enraged. Traitorous. Or traitorous, Teller said of York to his Livermore colleagues. I'm really finished this, chapter 3. Just 2 weeks after his Puerto Rico trip, President Eisenhower took action. In his memoirs, the president wrote, I formally proposed to Chairman Khrushchev a measure we had been considering, a meeting of experts whose technical studies would precede any political conference. Come summer, scientific experts from the United States and the Soviet Union would meet in Geneva to discuss how to put an end to nuclear weapons tests once and for all. The centerpiece was test detection. ARPA would be in charge of overseeing this new technology, which included seismic and atmospheric sensing, designed to make sure that no one cheated on the test ban. The program was called VELA. Its technology was highly classified and included 3 sub-programs: VELA Hotel, VELA Uniform, and VELA Sierra. The leaders of the world's 2 superpowers each had a vested interest in making this test ban happen. Each man was tired of having to live and govern under the nuclear sword of Damocles. Both Eisenhower and Khrushchev would send their most qualified scientists to Geneva with a mission to sort out any differences and to make the moratorium happen. President Eisenhower made a bold and brilliant move with his choice. Instead of sending one of his science advisors who wanted nuclear weapons tests to stop, he chose a scientist who did not, Ernest Lawrence. He so committed to nuclear weapons tests was Ernest Lawrence that he had recently told Congress, if we stop testing, well, God forbid, we will have to use weapons that will kill 50 million people that need not have been killed. Yeah. President Eisenhower was determined to bring about a test ban, but he was also determined to ensure that the Soviets could not and would not cheat. In sending Lawrence on his behalf, Eisenhower knew that the Soviet scientists' intentions would be under intense scrutiny. For the first time since Castle Bravo, the 8th contest that is, there was a sense of hope in the air. Meanwhile, at Harper, Herb York was about to get to work on the Vila programme. Vila would soon become ARPA's second biggest programme after Defender, which was ARPA's colossal effort to advance anti-ballistic missile technology. The Air Force and later NASA to advance sensor technology so the United States could certify that no nuclear weapons were being detonated in secret. Vila Hotel developed a high-altitude satellite system to detect nuclear explosions from space. Vila Uniform developed ground sensors able to detect nuclear explosions underground and produced a program to monitor and read seismic noise across the globe. Vila Sierra monitors potential nuclear explosions in space itself. So much rested on the success of the Geneva Convention of experts. Putting an end to nuclear weapons tests would slow the arms race and dramatically reduce the chances for all-out nuclear war. But could it be done? And again, that's finished. And we're on to Emergency Plans, Chapter 4. And I'm going to take a 5 minutes break. And we'll just listen to some birds, shall we? I'll hang the phone out the window and you can hear the M6 roaring away in the background over the bird noise. So, marvellous, isn't it? I need a little break and visit the latrine for a general evacuation of the excess fluid in the bladder. Thank you. There we go. Here's the birds and the M6. Lovely. good. Nobody's paying attention, that's fine. But, it's all for the archives. It'll be dug up in the future. Yeah, right. Good. This will be put in a time capsule, and that's read by the folks of the future, should any survive the catastrophic insanity which we now encounter. Yes. Toe-to-toe with the total insanity. And one was, we're almost on chapter 4, which is coming up in about a countdown to 30 seconds. And counting. 30 seconds and counting. Yeah. Okay. Chapter 4 of Annie Jacobson's book, excellent book, The Pentagon's Brain. Chapter 4, Emergency Plans. For Herb York, the sense of hopelessness that followed him back home from Puerto Rico did not last long. Shortly after the president announced his plans for a nuclear test ban, a 22-page secret document called the Emergency Plans Book arrived on York's desk at the Pentagon. Its classified contents were nothing short of apocalyptic. They would remain classified for the next 40 years. When, in 1998, the Defense Department learned that an author named L. Douglas Keeney had discovered a copy of the Emergency Plans Book inside, excuse me, I've got a bit of an itch up there, not yeah, oh my goodness me, sorry about that. It's possible, haven't it? You don't get this on BBC, do you? That's just absolutely marvellous, isn't it? Drill. Yeah. Oh, yeah, deep in the mind, isn't it? Yeah, well, there we go. Pickets. Right. Sorry about that. That's a bit of a bad joke. Pathetic joke, actually. Yes. Right. Where are we going? Right. So, Herb York's desk, slam, a classified document called the a secret document called the Emergency Plans Book arrived on York's desk at the Pentagon. Its classified contents were nothing short of apocalyptic. They would remain classified for the next 40 years when in 1998 the Defense Department learned that an author named L. Douglas Keeney had discovered a copy of the Emergency Plans Book inside a declassified U.S. Air Force file at the National Archives. The Pentagon immediately reclassified the report. Keeney, however, made public the contents of the copy he had come across, but the original document remains classified. For defense officials, the Emergency Plans Book served as the only approved guidance to departments and agencies regarding what to expect before, during, and after a Soviet nuclear attack on U.S. soil. Issued by the Office of Emergency Planning, a federal agency whose function it was to coordinate and control wartime mobilization activities, the book was not a hypothetical war game. It was official protocol. To those familiar with its contents, it would become known as the Doomsday Scenario. The scenario begins on a hypothetical D-Day in the not-so-distant future. Because of the inadequacy of US capabilities at the time, the first strike comes as a surprise. The Soviet sleeper cells have managed to emplace by clandestine means several hydrogen bombs inside the continental United States, and these weapons are the first to explode. Thermonuclear war has begun. In quick succession, Soviet submarines swarm the eastern and western seaboards, firing nuclear missiles at dozens of inland targets. At roughly the same time, the Soviets launch a catastrophic air attack against the United States using bombers and fighter jets. The US Air Defense Command destroys a substantial portion of the attacking swarms, but at least half of the Soviet aircraft are able to fire off their tactical nuclear weapons before being shot down. The opening salvo comes to a climax as hundreds of incoming ICBMs launched from the Soviet Union reach the US mainland. The majority of these nuclear-armed missiles are able to outfox the Army's Ajax missile batteries and strike military and civilian targets across the nation. In less than 1 hour, 25 million Americans are dead. The Soviets have all but decapitated US military installations, write the authors of the Emergency Plans book, including most atomic weapons facilities, naval bases, airfields, and army bases. All major communication centers, financial districts, and transportation hubs have been targeted for attack, and the majority of them have suffered catastrophic losses. America's infrastructure has been obliterated. Virtually nothing remains of Washington, D.C. Even those living in rural America experience death and destruction on a cataclysmic scale. Because of automated targeting errors, many of the nuclear weapons miss their intended targets and instead strike at random across the heartland. Although crippled, the US military has not been destroyed, and the counterattack begins. Notwithstanding severe losses of military and civilian personnel and material, the authors predict, air operations against the enemy are continuing and our land and naval forces are heavily engaged. Both sides are making use of atomic weapons for tactical air support and in the land battle. Lightweight portable nuclear weapons like Livermore's Davy Crockett bomb, yes, that's the one with the beaver tail at the back of it, helping with the descent, yeah, no doubt, are deployed across the nation by the thousands as Soviet ground forces invade. Next comes a final full-scale nuclear exchange, ICBMs raining down from the skies by the hundreds. Coastal naval bases are pummeled with hydrogen bombs. Ports are clogged with sinking ships. Merchant shipping comes to a halt. Surface transportation and aircraft capacity are non-existent. There are now hundreds of ground zeros across America, and everything within a 5 to 10 mile radius of each one has been obliterated. The confluence of fireballs has created a series of major firestorms. Forests and cities are in flames. Those who escape being burned to death are subject to varying degrees of deadly radiation. The surface bursts have resulted in widespread radioactive fallout of such intensity that over substantial parts of the United States, the taking of shelter for considerable periods of time is the only means of survival. In the document's post-attack analyses, things get much worse. 100 million American survivors now live in a nation entirely without the rule of law. The government is paralyzed. Roughly 50 million people are in need of immediate emergency medical attention, half of whom will require hospitalization for up to 12 weeks. 12.5 million others have received lethal doses of radiation and will die in the next few days, regardless of treatment. Health resources are in a critical state. The doctors and nurses who survived the first strike cannot begin to handle what is now being asked of them. Of a pre-attack total of 1.6 million US hospital beds, 100,000 remain. Radiation is but one malady. Communicable diseases including typhoid fever, smallpox, tetanus, and streptococcal diseases begin to run rampant. Day-to-day production of food comes to a halt. Most salvageable food stocks have been contaminated. Widespread looting has begun, with survivors hoarding what little remains. The housing system has gone critical. Millions of homes were destroyed in the nuclear exchange. Millions of people now have nowhere to live. Fallout has made proportions of the eastern seaboard uninhabitable. There is no electricity, no refrigeration, no transportation, and no community water systems. Another deadly health menace emerges with the inability of the survivors to dispose of human waste, or the dead bodies of millions killed in a single day. Then comes a knockout punch. Along the coast, bubonic plague, cholera, and typhus are expected to emerge, write the authors, part of a Soviet biological warfare secondary attack. The authors of the secret document clearly believe the Soviets to be the kind of enemy who will stop at nothing. Americans who managed to survive nuclear Armageddon must now prepare for the emergence of incurable diseases like bubonic plagues. Wow. By the 21st century, catastrophic narratives like the doomsday scenario would become a staple of post-apocalyptic fiction films and video games. But in 1958, this was the first and only known official document of its kind. In Santa Monica, RAND analysts regularly gamed out first and second strike scenarios as war games, which Air Force officials would then use to persuade Congress to allocate more funds for the Strategic Air Command. But the emergency plans book was not a what if, it was a here's when. It was a doctrine, an official reference manual. It was also not a report that could be ignored. The emergency plans book was sent to the highest ranking defense officials in each of the military services. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Director of ARPA, the Secretary of Defense, each of the Assistant Secretaries of Defense, and the Director of the National Security Agency. In a cover letter, the Director of the Office of Emergency Planning instructed recipients to submit changes or indicate they had none. As for Herb York, when faced with his portrait of extreme cataclysm, the ARPA director did not lose sight of the agency's mission to prevent strategic surprise. Submitting or not submitting notes to the Office of Emergency Planning was for York a moot point. Herb York had another plan in play, a seemingly preposterous idea that was already several years in the making. What if ARPA could create a defensive shield over the entire United States and stop incoming Soviet ICBMs in their tracks. York believed it could be done on account of a theory that had been proposed to him by an eccentric, brilliant and obscure scientist named Nicholas Christophilos. As York later explained, Christophilos believed it was possible to create an astrodome-like defensive shield made up of high-energy electrons trapped in the Earth's magnetic field just above the atmosphere. It sounded ludicrous, something straight out of a Marvel comic book, but York thought it just might work. Excuse me a second, I need to plug the phone into the charger. Right. There we go. Be a sec. Right, see if it's charging. Let's check. Yep. Right. Exciting stuff, this, isn't it? Totally insane, of course, but interesting. Right, so it sounded ludicrous, this idea of Nicholas Christophilos. Something straight out of a Marvel comic book, but York thought it just might work. Which is why, in the summer of '58, Herb York gathered together a group of the nation's top scientists and had them briefed on this radical classified idea. York wanted to know what the top men of science thought of what he called the Christophilos effect. The top secret program had already been given the go-ahead by the President of the United States. In March '58, York met with Eisenhower and personally briefed him on plans for an ARPA operation to test the Christophilos effect. By summer, the idea was no longer just an idea, but ARPA's first full-scale operation. Order 758 went by the cover name Project Floral. How nice, how lovely. Oh, Project Floral. Oh, they're lovely. What lovelies they are. What lovelies. Absolutely lovely. Yeah, its real name, which was classified, was Operation Argus. And of course, Argus is the mythological creature with 1,000 eyes. You know. Yeah. Yeah, got thousands of eyes all over us every day. Yeah. The old cameras everywhere. Yeah. Wonderful. Sorry, it wasn't 1,000 eyes. She's corrected me here. I was reading ahead and remembering my mythology slightly incorrectly. Right. The top secret restricted data limited distribution operation order 758 went by the cover name Project Floral. Its real name, which was classified, was Operation Argus, for the mythological giant with 100 eyes. It's only 100, never mind. Right. July '58. With top secret clearances in place, 22 defense scientists gathered at the National War College at Fort McNair in Washington, D.C., with the goal of producing ARPA Study Number 1. The gathering went by its own code name, Project 137. Its purpose, explained York, was to identify problems not now receiving adequate attention in the national security domain. Fort McNair was a delightful place to work, remembered Marvin Murph Goldberger, one of Project 137 scientists, one of the Project 137 scientists. The facility was one of the oldest army posts in the nation and one of the most genteel. Each morning the scientists gathered in Roosevelt Hall, a grand neoclassical building of red brick with granite trim overlooking the Potomac. There they listened to Defense Department officials deliver briefings on America's defense problems selected for their urgency. Then the scientists gathered in groups to discuss what had been said and brainstorm science-based solutions. Afternoons were spent writing. In the early evening, everyone would dine together in the War College mess hall and discuss Soviet threats. They were dealing with a total of 68 national security problems and programs, from submarine warfare and balloon warfare to biological weapons, chemical sensing, and the possibility of inventing a laser beam weapon. But the most interesting program by far, as Goldberger recalls, was the Christophilos effect. Hearing about it required its own special clearance. Goldberg said, the Project 137 group was led by John Wheeler, a Princeton University physicist famous for coining the term black hole. Black hole. Top hole, black hole. Yes. Working alongside Wheeler were 5 others from Princeton, 4 from Berkeley, 3 from the University of Illinois, 1 from Stanford, and 1 from the University of Chicago, and 1 from Caltech. 4 scientists came from the federally funded nuclear laboratories Los Alamos, Livermore, Oak Ridge, and Sandia. 2 scientists came from the defense industry, 1 from General Dynamics and another from DuPont Chemical Company. Yay! These were advanced scientific thinkers of the most serious kind. The supermen of hard science. Among them were particle physicists, theoretical physicists, astrophysicists, chemists, mathematicians, an economist, a nuclear weapons engineer. There were men who coined terms like hexaquark, wormholes, and quantum foam. 2 of them, Eugene Wigner and Val Fitch, would win the Nobel Prize in Physics. All of the scientists were experienced in Defense Department work, and many had been part of the Manhattan Project during World War II. Stated requirements for membership in Project 137 were ingenuity, practicality, and motivation. We listened to Nick Christophilos discussing the Christophilos effect, recalled Goldberger. He was a strange kind of genius. Christophilos's theoretical astrodome shield was like the hoped-for result of exploding a large number of nuclear weapons in space as a means of defending against incoming ICBMs. By Christophilos's count, this likely meant thousands per year in the lower reaches of the atmosphere. Wow. These explosions, he said, would produce a huge range of radioactive atoms, and these in turn would emit high-energy electrons, beta particles, and inject them into a region of space where the Earth's magnetic fields would trap and hold them for a long time. Christophilos figured that this electromagnetic field could last months or perhaps longer, and that the trapped electrons would cause severe radiation and even heat damage to anything man or nuclear weapon, or a nuclear weapon to anything man or nuclear weapon that tried to fly through the region. In short, the idea was that the arming and firing mechanisms of the incoming Soviet ICBMs would be fried. Christophilos had presented the idea a few years earlier, back when York was the chief scientist at Livermore. His purpose was of epic proportions, York recalls. His idea was the most amazing and original of all, not only at Livermore, but to my knowledge in the entire country. A plan to create an impenetrable shield of high-energy electrons above our heads, a shield that would destroy any nuclear warhead that might be sent against us. But exploding thousands of nuclear weapons in space each year was an impractical proposition. At the time, Nick presented these proposals. At the time Nick presented these proposals, I could not conceive of a procedure for actually carrying them out, said York. In sum, there was simply no place to take an invention like Nick's. Then York became chief scientist at ARPA. That would be crazy, isn't it? As if that nuclear radiation stuff isn't going to filter down to Earth, you know. It's ridiculous. Anyway, Nicholas Christophilos had an unusual backstory. He was born in Boston to Greek immigrant parents, but at the age of 7, returned with his family to Athens, where he went to school, dreamed about science, and became an amateur radio operator. He graduated from the National Technical University in Athens in 1938 and went to work in an elevator factory. His first job was as an elevator installer. When the Nazis took over Athens, Christophilos's elevator factory was converted to a truck repair facility. Christophilos's left with very little to do, Christophilos kept himself busy learning German. Eventually, he was able to read the German language, physics textbooks, and scientific journals that his new Nazi bosses left lying around the factory. According to Herb York, Nick Christophilos began focusing his attention in the design of high-energy accelerators, cyclotrons, and the like. With no formal training, and in the matter of a few years, Christophilos transformed himself from an elevator technician into one of the most ingenious scientists in the modern world. There are almost no details about his work during this dark time of occupation and war, but 3 years after the end of the war, in 1948, he wrote a letter to the University of California Radiation Laboratory in Berkeley, purporting to describe a new invention. According to York, the letter was apparently not easy to decipher, but when a scientist at Livermore finally did puzzle it out, says York, he discovered that it was only another way of describing the synchrocyclotron, a device that had been invented independently several years before by Edwin Macmillan, a chemist at Berkeley, and Vladimir Veskler, a physicist in the USSR. Papers describing that invention had already been published more than a year before Nick's letter arrived, so it was set aside and forgotten, said York. Right. The supposition was that the letter writer could have gotten the information from the academic paper. Then, 2 years later, scientists at Livermore received a second letter from Nicholas Christophilos, this one describing another type of particle accelerator. It was considerably more complex than the first, said York, and whoever was assigned to read it could not make out what it was trying to say. Same as the first letter, it was cast aside. 2 years later, 2 nuclear physicists at the Brookhaven National Laboratory of Long Island published a paper describing an accelerator. This was so technologically advanced that for the first time in the history of science, a machine could produce particles with more than 1 billion electron volts of energy. 1 billion electron volts of energy, wow. noted York. As it so happened, Christophilus had recently moved to the United States. When he read the article in a science journal, he contacted the authors to tell them he had already invented that machine in his mind and had described it in a letter that was on file with the Livermore lab. He had described it in a letter. Right, okay. When Christophilus demanded due credit for the invention in search of the record, a search of the record was made. Sure enough, according to York, Christophilus had a clear priority of invention. Wow. Naturally, recalled York, the discovery that a Greek elevator installer had priority in this very sophisticated invention produced a flurry of interest and reaction. In 1954, Christophilus was offered a job at Brookhaven, where a huge accelerator based on his invention was built. But soon Christophilus became bored with the invention he had imagined years before. He was already well on to two other ideas when Herb York learned the strange story of Nicholas Christophilus. He saw great potential and hired him. Just going to shut the windows. I'm getting rather cold legs. I'm shutting out the noise of the blessed M6. The hospital has kindly, been obviously for the rest and relaxation of the poor distressed inmates has been built right next to the motorway and a massive in the middle of a massive industrial estate. With a massive truck company making extraneous noises in the middle of the night to wake the patients and disturb their unquiet dreams. Yes. Right, where are we? Blah, 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 blah. So you heard York hired this Christophilus because he saw great potential right in him. Resistance came from the federal security clearance people. Oh, how lovely. They found it hard to believe that an elevator mechanic had accomplished all that Christophilus had claimed, said York. He must be, they thought, some sort of a mole that the Russians had pumped full of ideas not of his own. Clearance officers finally authorized Christophilus to work at Livermore, giving him access to top secret information, but he was denied the coveted Q clearances, which allows a scientist access to nuclear secrets. At Livermore, Christophilus produced one seminal idea after another. Eventually, he was granted higher clearances than just about everyone else around him. When Sputnik flew for the first time, Christophilus became convinced that the Russians had gained a too significant scientific advantage over the United States, that they were likely planning a surprise attack. He threw all his energy and ingenuity into finding a way to keep this from happening. Now, the Project 137 scientists were at a crossroads. It was risky and expensive, but if the Christophilus effect worked, it would be a magic bullet answer to ballistic missile defense. At Fort McNair, the scientists agreed that the Christophilus effect was worth investigating. In practical terms, it was the best idea anyone had come up with. How nice. The scope of national security threats facing the nation left many of the project 137 scientists with a deep sense of foreboding, scratching their heads and bottoms in dismay. Sorry, that was an aside. It caused responsible people sleepless nights, John Wheeler said. Although all of the scientists had worked on Defense Department programs before, learning of 68 threats concurrently weighed heavily on the conscience, Goldberger recalled. Many of the members of Project 137 were deeply disturbed, and others even shocked by the gravity of the problems with which they found themselves confronted. Wheeler wrote in his after-action report for ARPA, the group has developed a strong feeling for and deep appreciation of the great crisis with which the nation is faced. The group senses the rapidly increasing danger into which we are inexorably heading. Much rested on the success of Operation Argus, now set to unfold at the bottom of the world. Halfway across the Earth, in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, the men of Task Force 88 were assembled as far away from civilization as a man can get without being in Antarctica itself. The spot had been chosen because it was outside shipping lanes in a remote expanse, the tip of South America and the tip of Africa, east of a dip in the magnetic field known as the Brazilian anomaly. The weather was unpredictable, and there was the issue of high seas. It was in this rough ocean that the US military planned to launch 3 nuclear weapons into space, off the back of a moving seaplane tender called the USS Norton Sound. The hope was that the Christofilos effect would create a great enough disturbance in the Earth's geomagnetic fields, in the layers of the ionosphere, and in radio waves that it would ruin the delicate electronics housed inside any incoming missiles. An extraordinary number of men and machines were involved in Operation Argos, the only fully classified test in the history of US nuclear testing. No part of the operation was made public, nor would the public know about it until the New York Times broke the story 6 months after its completion. There were 4,500 military personnel, hundreds of scientists and engineers, 21 fixed-wing aircraft, 8 Sikorsky helicopters, 3 destroyers, a fleet oiler, an aircraft carrier, a seaplane tender, more than a dozen Lockheed X-17 missiles, and 3 nuclear warheads involved. ARPA was the agency in charge, with divisions from the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, shouldering major elements of the operation. Satellites, each carrying a payload of 100 pounds of recording instruments, would be placed in equatorial and polar orbits by the Army Ballistic Missile Agency shortly before the tests. The sensors would record effects and relay data. With so many moving parts on so many different continents, any number of things could go wrong. Weather was a major unknown to contend with. Operation Argus involved firing 3 nuclear-tipped Lockheed X-17 missiles off the back of a moving ship. The USS Norton Sound was capable of launching a missile in winds of up to 46 miles per hour, but no one had expected waves nearing 20 feet. The ship could make speed corrections to compensate for the wind, but the waves threatened to dangerously alter the missile trajectory in its boost stage. The commander of Task Force 88 was concerned with the safety of his crew, and with good reason. During a practice run of a missile launch, one of the X-17As failed in flight after only 25 seconds. Had there been a nuclear weapon in this in the nose cone, it would have produced a catastrophic catastrophic disaster. The missile would have been just a few thousand feet up, and exploding at that height would likely have killed or injured many of the crew. Making matters seem even more precarious, in the following test run, the missile failed again, this time just 3 seconds after launch. Secrecy was paramount to success. If the Christophyllos effect was achieved, it would produce massive disturbances across the Earth's upper atmosphere. These disruptions would be detected by every nation monitoring these kinds of phenomena, most notably the Soviets. Total secrecy meant the disturbances would infuriate the Soviets. They would have no idea what caused them and would most likely conclude the United States was working on top secret high altitude weaponry. This was one of the desired effects. 4 days before the first nuclear launch, all ships and aircraft were in place. US reconnaissance aircraft patrolled the skies over the South Atlantic. Ships carrying anti-aircraft rockets were at the ready. In the unforeseen event of a Soviet sabotage, the commander of Task Force 88 sent his final coded message to the ARPA office at the Pentagon, a prearranged indication that the operation was to go at his end. Dr. Livingstone, I presume, the commander stated clearly into a ship-to-shore radio microphone. The first test would take place on August 27, 58, although no one had a name for it at the time. Operation Argos was the world's first test of an electromagnetic pulse bomb, or EMP. Halfway across the world in Switzerland, a remarkable series of events was taking place. It was the height of the summer season, and Ernest O. Lawrence and his wife Molly were attending a party at the historic Parc des Ovives, an 18th century mansion on Lake Geneva. A mist rose off the lake. The weather was magnificent, and from the villa's terrace, where the couple sat behind protective glass, there were stunning panoramic views. Ernest and Molly Lawrence dined and watched fireworks. Wine flowed, and Ernest Lawrence was having a miserable time. For the first time in the history of nuclear weapons, top scientists from the United States and the Soviet Union have been meeting here in Geneva under the strictest of security provisions to hash out technical terms so that a nuclear test suspension could go forward. The Geneva Conference of Experts marked the ultimate low point in the prolific nuclear weapons career of Ernest Lawrence. For more than 20 years, Lawrence had been one of the nation's most vocal advocates for nuclear weapons development and testing, along with his deputy, Edward Teller. That Eisenhower wanted Lawrence to represent him distressed Lawrence when he was first asked, and it upset him even more now that he was attending the conference. The president has asked, so I must go, he told Molly before they left California. The very thought rendered Lawrence depressed over the idea, according to his biographer Herbert Childs. But still he felt it was his duty to accept and to go to Geneva. The conference lasted all summer, and for Lawrence the meetings were becoming increasingly stressful. There were so many important technical aspects to iron out, including ways in which each side could be certain that the other side would not cheat. For that, Lawrence brought his Livermore deputy Harold Brown, the young physicist who had taken over York's job as chief scientist at Livermore. Here in Geneva, Brown acted as Lawrence's technical advisor. In order to stop testing, both superpowers had to agree to the creation of a network of 170 seismic detection facilities across Europe, Asia, and North America. This technology effort was being spearheaded by ARPA through its Feeler Uniform program. Technology had advanced to the point where these detection facilities would soon be able to monitor and sense with close to 100% certainty any above-ground nuclear test over 1 kiloton, and with 90% certainty any underground test over 5 kilotons. Both sides knew that in some situations it was difficult for detection facilities to tell the difference between an earthquake and an underground test. These were the kinds of verification details that the experts were working to hash out. Ernest Lawrence had been attending meetings by day and social events by night. The situation was stressful, and now he was exhausted, like I am at the moment reading this incredible book. Whew. Lawrence was worried that there was something wrong with his health. He deeply distrusted the Soviets. Perhaps working with their scientists was making him ill. He had just returned from a first-class trip across India and Europe, travelling in private planes and being driven by chauffeurs. He and his family had visited with statesmen and Maharajas. There, he'd felt fine. Travel always made him feel better, and Molly suggested a day trip to the ski resort at Chamonix, Mont Blanc, in the nearby Alps. Lawrence agreed, and off they went. But upon his return, Lawrence came down with a fever. The next day he was unable to get out of bed. Oh dear. He just didn't seem to get well, although he didn't seem terribly sick, recalled his colleague Robert Backer, one of the three nuclear scientists officially representing the United States. Fearing her husband had pneumonia, Molly Lawrence called for a physician, Dr. Bernard Westmer. He examined Lawrence and noted that he was cheerful and did not seem acutely ill, despite some fever. Lawrence confided in the Swiss doctor he suffered from colitis, or inflammation of the bowels, he said, and he relapsed when he became tense. Irritable bowel syndrome, anyone? Yes, well, Well, Dr. Wismer gave him a proctoscopic exam. The magic finger, no doubt. As well, yes. And said he was in good health. The following day, Lawrence made some effort to attend the conference, but mostly he had Harold Brown participate on his behalf. Venturing out of his hotel room, he collapsed in the hallway. Molly suggested they return home. I could never live with myself if I left before the conference was over, Lawrence told his wife. Dr. Wismer prescribed penicillin. Then, later that week, after a lakeside lunch with a translator, the Berkeley professor, and Russian emigre Leonid Tikvinsky, Lawrence decided that he had had enough. This is it. We're going home tonight, he told his wife. Arriving back in California, Lawrence checked into a hospital. He never left. He was given a blood transfusion and was told he needed to have his colon removed. The thought of never being able to defecate like a healthy human horrified him, his biographer later revealed. Shortly after the surgery, Lawrence slipped into a coma. On August 27, he died. He had just turned 57 years old. The Livermore Laboratory would be renamed the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Halfway across the world, in a far corner of the South Atlantic, outside shipping lanes and
near a dip in the magnetic field on the same day that Ernest Lawrence died. The first of the three Argos high-altitude nuclear weapons was detonated. Argus 1 suffered an errant missile trajectory and missed its target, which was 340 nautical miles above the Earth, by more than 230 miles. 3 days later, Argus 2 also failed to reach its desired altitude and exploded roughly 84 nautical miles above the task force launching area. Dear me. The last and final test, Argus 3, was the most precarious. First with a misfire in high winds, followed by a nuclear explosion on September 6, 58, at an altitude of 150 nautical miles. Operation Argus proved to be a grand disappointment. The results were nothing close to what Nicholas Christophilos had predicted and Herb York had hoped for. While the Christophilos effect did occur, it was limited in intensity and very short-lived. More nuclear tests were needed, but the moratorium was coming. In Switzerland, the Geneva Conference of Experts, the scientists... In Switzerland, at the Geneva Conference of Experts, the scientists submitted their final report. Given advances in the technology of detection, American and Soviet scientists now agreed that it was to cease nuclear testing forthwith. If one side cheated, they would be caught. President Eisenhower was delighted. The very next day, he held a press conference to announce that the United States would halt nuclear testing starting on October 31 if the Soviets formally agreed to halt testing as well. At Livermore in California, Edward Teller was furious. He had no intention of giving up nuclear testing without protest. 2 days after the death of his colleague and boss, Ernest Lawrence, even before Lawrence was buried, Teller sent a classified telegram to Brigadier General Alfred Starbird, the defense official at the Pentagon in charge of nuclear weapons tests. The telegram marked priority, had the subject heading Thoughts in Connection to the Test Moratorium. Teller told Starbird that the test ban was a threat to national security, that it showed weakness and vulnerability and opened up America to a sneak nuclear attack. The purpose of this telegram is in part to clarify laboratory plans and in part to point out dangers in connection with future discussions concerning the test moratorium, Teller wrote furiously. The laboratory must continue research and development of nuclear weapons, he wrote, in order to comply with the president's directive. More tests needed to be done in order to make sure it was safe to comply. Furthermore, he argued, many of Livermore's nuclear tests were not tests per se, but rather scientific experiments, as Operation Argos was. There was a loophole to be explored, Teller suggested. Explorations below a kiloton cannot be detected and identified by any of the methods considered realistic by any of the delegations at the Geneva Conference, he wrote. The United States could secretly conduct low-yield tests. It would be cheating, but the Russians could not be trusted, and surely they would cheat too. That's Edward Teller for you. And that's the end of chapter 4. And perhaps later on we'll go on to chapter 5, which is 1600 seconds until doomsday. Thanks very much, everyone, for not paying any attention. So nice of you, but anyone wanting to look back at this in the future, not paying attention at the moment, that is, but obviously in the replay. Thank you for your or continued attention to these rather serious matters and interesting historical facts about the insanity behind the absolutely insane people who even now control our world. Yes, so there we go. This is exactly what we're up against, and yes, it is a very formidable adversary. Right, let's say bye-bye and love and peace, and let it prevail. One day, perhaps we shall overcome, as in the old song, you know. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome one day. If we don't, it's curtains for us all, isn't it? Yep, okay. Bye for now. Thank you. Cheers.